August 1944. The Falaise Pocket, Normandy. The history books will tell you that the destruction of the German army in the Falaise Pocket was an American achievement. Patton's Third Army driving north, the armored sweep. The trap snapping shut on two entire German armies, the 5th Panzer and the 7th, somewhere in the rolling Norman countryside between Falaise and Argentan. The history books are not wrong, they are incomplete. Because closing a gap is not the same as holding it closed while two panzer armies try to break through it with everything they have left. And the force that held the eastern shoulder of that gap, that stood in the path of the German breakout and refused to move while Tiger tanks and SS infantry hammered at them for 72 hours, was not American. It was not British. It was the 4th Canadian Armoured Division and the 1st Polish Armoured Division dug into a piece of high ground called Hill 262 that the Canadians had taken to calling simply the Mace. And what happened on that hill is one of the most savage and least remembered engagements of the entire Northwest European campaign. To understand why Hill 262 mattered, you need to understand what the Falaise Pocket contained. After the Allied breakout from Normandy in late July and early August 1944, German Army Group B found itself being encircled. Patton's armored columns had swung east and then north with a speed that German command had not believed possible. The British and Canadians were pushing south from Caen. The circle was tightening. Inside the circle were approximately 100,000 German soldiers, the bulk of the armored strength remaining to Germany in the west. SS Panzer divisions, veteran infantry, the men who had held Normandy against the Allied invasion for 2 months. If they escaped, they would fight again. If the pocket held completely, Army Group B ceased to exist as a fighting force. The war in the West shortened by months, possibly longer. Allied command understood this. Closing the pocket was the operational priority. Holding it closed was the problem nobody had fully planned for. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division had been fighting through the Normandy campaign since July, taking the kind of losses that the summer of 1944 produced with mechanical regularity. By August, they were experienced in the specific way that surviving armored warfare makes a unit experienced, stripped of illusions, short of men, clear-eyed about what the next engagement was likely to cost. Their primary anti-tank weapon was the 17-pounder gun, mounted on the M10 Wolverine tank destroyer. The 17-pounder was the only Allied gun in 1944 capable of reliably penetrating a Tiger tank's frontal armor at combat ranges. The Americans had preferred the 75mm and 76mm. The Canadians had looked at what Tigers did to Shermans at Normandy and reached a different conclusion. That decision, made months earlier in a planning room, was about to matter enormously on a Norman hillside. On the night of August 18th, Canadian and Polish units seized the high ground at Hill 262, cutting the last viable escape route from the Falaise Pocket. The German armies inside had a choice: surrender or break through. They chose to break through. What followed on August 19th and 20th was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a siege conducted in reverse, the surrounded force attacking outward with the full weight of its remaining armor and a smaller force on the high ground absorbing that weight and refusing to give it back. The German breakout came in waves. SS Panzer units that had fought from Stalingrad to Normandy, that had destroyed Allied armor throughout the summer with a professionalism that Allied tank crews had learned to respect in the most direct way possible. They came at Hill 262 with Tigers, Panthers, and infantry in numbers that made the Canadian and Polish positions mathematically indefensible by any conventional calculation. The Canadian anti-tank crews answered with the 17-pounder. The records show what happened in those 72 hours with a precision that later analysis has confirmed. Canadian M10 Wolverines and towed 17-pounder guns dug into hull-down positions on the reverse slopes of Hill 262, engaged German armor at ranges under 400 meters, terrain that nullified the Tigers' long-range advantage and forced engagements where the 17-pounder's penetration was absolute and decisive. A Tiger tank at 400 meters, approaching uphill across broken ground, is a different problem than a Tiger at 1,500 meters on flat terrain. At distance, the Tiger's 88mm gun and near-impenetrable frontal armor make it a mobile fortress. Up close, on a hillside, with Canadian guns waiting in positions selected for exactly this engagement geometry, the Tiger becomes something it almost never was in 1944. Vulnerable. German after-action reports from the Breakout attempt contain assessments of the Canadian defensive positions that are striking in their directness. Multiple reports note that the Canadian anti-tank disposition was not reactive, it was anticipatory. The guns were positioned not where a defending force would normally place them, but where an attacking force coming from inside the pocket would be funneled by the terrain. The Canadians had read the ground from the attacker's perspective. They had spent the entire summer being shot at by people who knew how to use terrain. They had learned that lesson at a price that cannot be calculated in anything less personal than names, and they applied it on Hill 262 with lethal precision. This is not the language of tactical manuals. It is the language of experience accumulated under fire. A platoon commander who has watched a Tiger destroy 3 of his vehicles from a position he didn't see coming develops a particular interest in understanding how positions become invisible. He studies the ground differently afterward. He thinks about where he would park a gun if he were trying to kill himself, and then he parks it there. The Polish 1st Armoured Division, fighting alongside the Canadians, absorbed punishment that was equally savage and held with equal stubbornness. Cut off from resupply, running critically low on ammunition, taking casualties from both the German Breakout force and Luftwaffe aircraft still operating over the pocket in these final hours. Their situation was, by any objective measure, untenable. The mathematics demanded they break. They did not break. By August 21st, the Falaise Gap was closed. The German armies inside the pocket had ceased to exist as organized fighting formations. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were captured. The dead numbered in the tens of thousands. Equipment losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. Armor, artillery, vehicles, the accumulated material of 2 field armies that Germany could not rebuild in time to affect the outcome of the war. Eisenhower visited the pocket after the battle and described it as one of the greatest killing grounds of any war. The roads were so choked with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned equipment that movement required bulldozers to clear a path before trucks could follow. Post-war military analysis assessed the 4th Canadian Armoured Division's role in holding the eastern shoulder as having been decisive to the closure of the gap. The finding is not ambiguous. If Hill 262 had fallen, the Breakout succeeds. The 2 German armies escape relatively intact. The war in the West continues into 1946 at minimum, with all the lives, on all sides, that those additional months would have consumed. That assessment is in the records. It is documented. It is not disputed by any serious military historian who has examined the Falaise operation in detail. It is simply not widely known. Because the Falaise Pocket, in the popular memory of the Second World War, belongs to Patton, to the armored drive, to the audacious American sweep that created the encirclement. Creating the trap is a better story than holding it shut. Creation is dramatic. Endurance is not. Standing on a hill and refusing to move while Tiger tanks try to push you off, it does not produce the kind of narrative that gets made into films and remembered in anniversaries. But the men who held Hill 262 knew something the narrative does not capture. They knew that the trap Patton created was only a trap if someone closed it. They were the ones who closed it, not because they were ordered to and had no choice, because they understood what the hill meant and what it would cost to give it back, and they made the calculation that the hill was not theirs to give. The German armies that broke through the gap, a fraction of what entered the pocket, regrouped east of the Seine and fought on for another 9 months of war. The German armies that did not break through were finished as a fighting force on a Norman hillside in August 1944. The difference between those 2 outcomes was 17-pounder shells and the soldiers who loaded them and the positions those soldiers had chosen because they had spent a summer learning how the ground worked. The records show it, the German reports confirm it. And the ground at Hill 262, if you go there today, still carries the specific silence of a place where something permanent was decided. Burned steel absorbed into the earth, craters long since grown over, a memorial stone on the crest with a name on it. They held. And because they held, the trap closed. And because the trap closed, 2 German armies ended on a Norman hillside instead of fighting for another year. The history books give Patton the Falaise Pocket. The records give the Canadians the hill. The men who held Hill 262 came home to Canada after the war and largely resumed their lives without ceremony. The tankers went back to the farms and factories and small towns that had produced them. Some attended regimental reunions for decades, some did not. The particular variety of pride that comes from doing something decisive that nobody noticed tends to be a quiet pride, carried inward rather than displayed. But in the German military archives, in the after-action reports of the officers who tried to break through Hill 262 and failed, the assessment is written clearly and without ambiguity. The Canadian position was well chosen. The Canadian fire was accurate. The Canadian resistance was sustained beyond what the attacking force had calculated as possible. Beyond what the attacking force had calculated as possible. That phrase, in a German military document about a Canadian defensive action, is the truest measure of what happened on that hill. Not the medals, not the official commendations, not the pages in the history books that are already too full of other names. The enemy wrote the assessment. The enemy knew what the hill cost them. And the enemy's verdict is the one that matters, because the enemy had every reason to minimize it and no reason to fabricate it. Patton created the trap. The Canadians held it shut. Now you know.